You need to understand something before we go any further. What you are about to hear will either make you close this immediately, or it will save your relationship with God from a slow, quiet death. There is no third option, because right now, millions of faithful Catholics are walking into Mass every Sunday believing something that is not only false, it is actively destroying their spiritual life. And almost no one is talking about it. The belief is this, that God demands 10% of your income, and if you fail to give it, you are robbing Him, and you are under a curse, and you are not in right standing with the Church. This belief has been preached from pulpits, printed in parish bulletins, and reinforced by well-meaning instructors who did not know any better. But it is a lie, and lies, when they are believed long enough, become chains. Chains that bind your conscience, chains that turn prayer into accounting, chains that make you dread the moment the ushers stand up and the basket starts moving toward your row. If you have ever felt that dread, you are not broken. You are not lacking generosity. You are not a bad Catholic. You are a soul who has been fed a counterfeit gospel wrapped in the language of stewardship, and your spirit has been trying to reject it ever since. Your spirit knows something is wrong. It knows that a father does not invoice his children. It knows that love offered under threat is not love at all. And it knows that something about the way tithing is taught does not sound like the voice of the shepherd. It sounds like the voice of a creditor. And you are right. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to walk through this together, not as a lecture, not as a theology class, not as a debate. We are going to walk through this as a dismantling. We are going to take apart the false framework piece by piece, see where it came from, see what it has done to you, and then build something genuine in its place. And when it is over, you are going to experience something you may not have felt in years: freedom. Real freedom. The freedom of a child who finally understands that his father is not waiting at the door with a bill. He is waiting with open arms. So let us begin with the image that will carry us through this entire journey. The crumbling wall. Every soul is a fortress. Every virtue is a stone. Every sacrament is mortar. Prayer is the watchman who scans the horizon for danger. Charity is the gate that swings open for the poor and swings shut against the enemy. A healthy soul has a strong wall, not because the wall was built in a day, but because every stone was chosen carefully, every layer of mortar was mixed with truth, and every guard on the tower was trained to recognize the difference between a friend and an infiltrator. But a wall can look strong and still be rotting from the inside. If just one stone is hollow, it can be replaced by the enemy before anyone notices. One hollow stone, that is all he needs. And the hollow stone he has placed in the walls of countless Catholic souls over the last 50 years is the doctrine of the mandatory tithe. It looks like a real stone. It has the weight of Old Testament language wrapped around it. It has the texture of financial responsibility. It has the color of piety, but it is hollow, and a wall built with hollow stones does not announce its weakness. It stands for years. It withstands mild weather. It impresses the neighbors. But then the storm comes, the real storm, the diagnosis you did not expect, the child who walks away from the faith, the marriage that begins to splinter, the job that disappears overnight. And when the storm hits, the hollow stones do not hold, they crumble. The wall collapses, and the soul that was protected only by religious appearances is suddenly exposed to the full force of the enemy's assault. That is when faith falls apart, not because God abandoned the soul, but because the soul had built its faith on a counterfeit foundation, and the counterfeit could not bear the weight of real suffering. This is what is at stake here. This is not a minor theological disagreement about budget models. This is about whether your faith will survive the next decade. Because if your relationship with God is built on a financial transaction, it will fail. It must fail. Transactions are not strong enough to carry the weight of a human soul. Only love can carry that weight. Only grace. Only the truth. Now, let me show you exactly how this hollow stone got placed in your wall. You did not put it there. Someone handed it to you, probably with good intentions, and told you it was authentic. Here is how it happened. You were told to read Malachi chapter 3. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse. You were told to read Genesis chapter 14, where Abraham gives a tenth of his spoils to Melchizedek. You were told that tithing preceded the law, that it was validated by Christ when he said you should tithe without neglecting the weightier matters, and that the church has always taught this. And because you trusted the person who told you these things, you accepted the stone. You built it into your wall. You began to give 10%. But you also began to feel something you did not expect, anxiety. First it was small, a faint worry when the end of the month came and the budget was tight. Then it grew, a quiet resentment when the parish announced another capital campaign while you were struggling to pay your own bills. Then it became habitual, a low-grade guilt that followed you into every Mass, every prayer, every moment you tried to lift your heart to God. You started asking questions you were afraid to voice. Does God really need my money? Am I actually cursed if I give 9%? Why do I feel worse after giving, not better? What kind of love is this? And those questions, which were the voice of your conscience trying to protect you, were silenced by the fear that asking them was a sin. So you stopped asking. You kept giving, and the wall kept crumbling from the inside. Now let me show you the spiritual mechanism of how this crumbles you. When you believe that God's favor is tied to a percentage, you stop relating to God as a father. You start relating to him as a banker. And a banker does not love you. A banker audits you. A banker calculates your value. A banker applies penalties when you miss a payment. A banker does not embrace you when you walk through the door. He reviews your account, so you start to pray like a debtor. Lord, I gave this month, so please. Lord, I hit my target, so can I ask? Lord, I fell short, so I know I deserve nothing. That is not prayer. That is a quarterly earnings call with the divine. And it will never, in 1,000 years, produce the intimacy that your soul was created for. Your soul was created for union with God, not transactions with God. Union, oneness. The kind of relationship where money is a detail, not the foundation. But you cannot experience union with God when you are terrified that you owe him money. Fear and union cannot coexist. They cancel each other out. The enemy knows this. He does not need to tempt you into atheism if he can tempt you into a relationship with God that is fundamentally broken at its core. He does not need you to reject the church if he can keep you inside the church but miserable, confused, and perpetually feeling like you have an unpaid invoice hanging over your head. He does not need you to stop giving if he can make you give for the wrong reasons and then let the resentment of those wrong reasons drive a wedge between you and the altar. This is demonic strategy, and it is working. Now let me address the biblical arguments directly, because this is where the confusion begins and this is where it must end. The tithe in the Old Testament was a tax, not a donation, a tax. It was imposed on the tribes of Israel to support the Levitical priesthood, which had no land inheritance, to fund the temple worship, and to provide for the poor within the nation. It was mandatory. It was enforceable. It was part of the civil and ceremonial law of a specific theocratic nation at a specific time in salvation history. The Old Covenant was a covenant of law. The New Covenant is a covenant of grace. When Christ fulfilled the law, the ceremonial and judicial precepts of the Old Covenant expired. The moral law remains because it is rooted in the nature of God and man. But the temple tax, the dietary restrictions, the ritual purity codes, the Levitical system, all of it was fulfilled and set aside. The veil tore. From top to bottom, God Himself declared the old system finished. To take one piece of that old system, the tithe, and resurrect it as a binding requirement for Christians is to ignore the entire theology of the New Testament. It is to rebuild what God tore down. And when someone tells you that Abraham tithed before the law, so therefore tithing is an eternal principle, they are making a category error. Abraham also offered animal sacrifices before the law. Abraham also practiced circumcision before the law. Do we resurrect those as binding requirements? No, because the new covenant has its own logic, its own economy, its own mechanisms of grace. The logic of the new covenant is not give 10%. The logic of the new covenant is give everything. Romans chapter 12. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, your whole self, 100%, not 10% of your income while you keep the rest for your own kingdom. Your entire life placed on the altar, united to the sacrifice of Christ, offered through the hands of Mary. That is the tithe of the new covenant. And when you give yourself completely, the question of money becomes secondary. It becomes a detail of stewardship, not the measure of your faithfulness. Now let me show you what the church has actually taught, because this will surprise you. The Council of Trent, addressing the sacraments, affirmed that the yoke of the old law is not to be imposed on the necks of Christians. Saint Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa, distinguishes between the moral, ceremonial, and judicial precepts and states clearly that the specific obligation of the Mosaic tithe does not bind Christians under divine law. Canon law obliges the faithful to support the material needs of the church, but it does not specify a fixed percentage. The Catechism speaks about the fifth precept of the church, which requires providing for the material needs of the church. But it too specifies no fixed amount. Church councils over the centuries have encouraged tithing as a guideline, as a practice, as a recommendation. But a recommendation is not a divine command. A guideline is not a binding law under pain of sin. And when a pastor or a teacher converts a recommendation into a mandate, he binds where the church has not bound. That binding is an error, and the error has consequences. Now let me show you those consequences in a concrete way, because real examples are how we see the damage. Consider a mother of 5. Her husband works 2 jobs. She manages the household, homeschools the children, and gives what she can to the parish. One Sunday, a guest speaker comes and preaches on the tithe. He says that if you are not giving 10% of your gross income, you are robbing God. He says that God cannot bless a household that is in rebellion over finances. He says that the reason some of you are struggling is because you have a closed hand instead of an open one. The mother hears this. She goes home. She calculates their income. She realizes they are giving about 5%. She feels sick. She thinks, I am the reason my family is not blessed. I am the reason my prayers feel unanswered. I am robbing God. So she starts giving more. But to do that, she has to cut somewhere else. She cuts the grocery budget. She stops setting aside money for the children's activities. She postpones a needed car repair. The family begins to feel the strain. Her husband notices the tension, but does not know the source. The children ask why they cannot do things their friends do. The mother grows silent, worn, weighed down by a spiritual debt she believes she owes. 6 months later, the transmission fails on the car. The repair is $2,000 more than they have. The mother breaks down. She says to God, I gave you everything I had. Why are you doing this to me? And in that moment, the hollow stone crumbles. Her faith does not survive the impact, not because God failed her, but because the false teaching she believed set her up for collapse. A loving God did not demand that she neglect her family to fund the parish, A loving God did not curse her car because she gave 5%. A loving God did not want her tears. He wanted her trust, and trust was the one thing the false teaching stole from her. This is not an isolated story. This is happening in parishes across the world. Souls are being crushed by a burden that Christ never placed on them. And the tragedy is that the answer is so simple, so clear, so thoroughly Catholic that it is almost embarrassing that the confusion exists at all. The answer is St. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. For God loves a cheerful giver, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, as he has decided in his heart. There it is, the whole teaching in one verse. The amount is not the issue. The percentage is not the issue. The issue is whether your gift flows from a free decision made in love or a pressured decision made in fear. If it flows from love, it is a fragrant offering. If it flows from fear, it is a debt payment. And debt payments do not ascend to heaven. Only love ascends to heaven. So the remedy begins with this question: when I put money in the basket, what do I feel? If you feel joy, peace, and a sense of participation in God's work, your giving is healthy. The amount does not matter. If you feel relief that you met the requirement, your giving is transactional. The amount does not matter. If you feel anxiety, guilt, or resentment, your giving is corrupted. The amount does not matter. The corruption is not in the money. It is in the framework. Change the framework and everything changes. So let us change the framework now. You are not required to tithe under pain of sin. You are required to support the church according to your ability, with a cheerful heart, in a spirit of charity. That is the Catholic teaching. The amount is between you and God. It is governed by prudence, which considers your obligations to your family, your debts, and your state in life. It is motivated by love, not fear. It is measured by sacrifice, not by a decimal point. If you can give more than 10% and you want to give it, if you can only give 2% and you give it with a full heart, it is a beautiful offering. If you are in a season of such poverty that you cannot give anything materially, give your prayers, give your suffering, give your presence. God does not audit, God receives. And what he receives, he multiplies, not necessarily in financial returns, but in grace, in peace, in virtue, in the quiet strength that comes from knowing you belong to the Father and nothing can take that from you. Now the wall begins to rebuild. The hollow stone is removed. The first real stone is placed. That stone is the truth. The second stone is confession. If you have been operating under this false framework for years, it has almost certainly produced sins that need to be confessed. Not the sin of failing to tithe, the sin of superstition, the sin of treating God as a debtor, the sin of resentment against the church, the sin of judging others who gave less, the sin of neglecting your family to meet a spiritual quota. Name these. Bring them to the sacrament. Receive absolution. Walk out with a clean conscience and a fresh start. The third stone is a rule of joyful giving. Sit down in prayer. Ask the Holy Spirit to guide you. Decide what you will give and decide it freely. Then live that rule with cheerfulness. Review it every year. Adjust it as your circumstances change. Never again let anyone bind your conscience beyond what the Church herself binds it. The fourth stone is devotion to Our Lady of Providence. Consecrate your resources to her. She is the perfect steward. She will stretch your loaves and fishes. She will intercede for your real needs. She will protect your household from the spiritual confusion that masquerades as piety. These four stones, truth, confession, a joyful rule, and Marian consecration, are the foundation of the new wall. And the new wall will not crumble, because it is not built on a formula. It is built on a person, the person of Jesus Christ. Now the warning, I must give it clearly. There are people who will hear this and use it as an excuse to give nothing. They will say, I do not have to tithe. And then they will close their hearts entirely. That is not freedom. That is selfishness wearing a mask of freedom. And it is just as dangerous as the legalism it pretends to replace. Do not be that person. The gospel calls you to a generosity that is boundless, radical, and sacrificial. Not a generosity that meets a quota and stops. A generosity that flows from the heart of Christ Himself, who gave everything, held back nothing, and calls you to do the same. The question is not, how little can I give and still be safe? The question is, how much love can I pour out before I am emptied? That is the Catholic question. And the only answer is the same answer the saints gave. Everything. You give everything, but you give it freely, not because the basket is coming, not because the curse is threatened, not because the pastor will frown, because you love. Because love cannot be contained, because love cannot be reduced to a decimal, because the God who owns everything already gave you His Son. And having given you His Son, how will He not also give you all things? The wall is rebuilt, the fortress is strong, the soldier is awake, and the enemy, who hoped to destroy you with a counterfeit stone, has been defeated by the truth. Now go, live this, share this. There is someone in your life right now who is sitting in a pew, hand trembling over their wallet, wondering why their faith feels so heavy. You know what they need. They need the truth. Give it to them, not with arrogance, with the gentleness of someone who was once in chains and has been set free. That is your mission. That is your assignment. Go to confession. Make your rule. Consecrate your resources. And then turn around and help someone else climb out of the same pit you just escaped. The church needs this, the world needs this. And your soul, finally and fully alive, will never again mistake the voice of a creditor for the voice of the Father.